All right, do you see just slides right now?
Just slides.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to go through this really quickly just because we are behind schedule. So what I'm going to try and focus, we have two parts we're going to do. I'm going to talk about architecture and design, and then Geraldine's going to go over more about, how we present this to people, how we think about it. We're going to try and focus a lot more on sort of what do we think, like what do we think about, how do we think when we're designing these things, and less about the specific architecture and stuff like that, because many of you are very familiar with that already from other conversations. So when we're trying to design everything on our side, we are really trying to stay focused on this data biosphere vision. We really want to have a lot of interoperable components, and that means we might build something, but other people might also build something. And so we want to be able to support having multiple clouds, multiple data providers, multiple analysis engines, multiple tool providers, all people sort of working together. And so the interoperability stuff is definitely, forefront in our minds as we build this. We try to use GA4GH standards wherever possible. So we've got integration with things like TERS and WES and DRS, and doing things now more with incorporating data use and researcher identity, especially with the RAS and the DUOS work. And we're going to try to incorporate those as much as possible. We want to have one standard wherever there's a standard possible that everybody uses. Otherwise, it gets very difficult to maintain. It gets very difficult to use things together. And so we want to try and move towards standards, where possible, and help drive the standards if they're not what we need. In terms of Terra, we are dealing with three main kinds of roles. We have on our side people that are actually generating data. So we do sequencing. We have projects we're generating data. We need to be able to support them getting their data shared. And so there are people that are working on like generating data for all of us, for example, or might be doing things with CCDG, or data with the NCI, various different NIH projects, single cell data. So, trying to have a platform that allows people to bring in data, have a platform that allows people to do the analysis on that data using workspaces, bringing in different tools, and then people that are tool developers. And it should really be a focus on, in the end, the biomedical researchers. What are we doing as bioinformaticians and as data generators to enable biomedical researchers to get their jobs done? Because that's really the most critical. If all we do is generate data but nobody can use it, it doesn't matter. Right now we're working on a re-architecture to try and support multiple clouds and be able to more easily integrate new resources. So we've got many different applications right now, like the single cell portal, all of us, the Terra platform, all of these different branded, UI components for Biodata Catalyst, NCI, all of that kind of stuff. These are all different portals that use various backend components that we provide. We've got interactive analysis like Jupyter Notebooks. We've got things like, data library we're trying to design to more easily bring in different data sources, reports on billing, bring in different tools like our workflow running in Jupyter, RStudio, IGV, things like that. And more easily manage like workspaces in a cloud agnostic way, data in a cloud agnostic way, and in a interoperable, searchable way. Where you can have the different kinds of code, how you can deal with different things like IAM policies, notifications, spinning up VMs, creating instances of BigQuery, like doing whatever kinds of things we need, tracking spend, which is incredibly important, and logging people's activity. What we focused on from the beginning is really having a single instance of our platform. We don't have different instances for different projects and for different data. We want one instance so that we can bring in data according to the data use, and we can go under the most restrictive guidelines in terms of security and compliance, which right now is all of us, and allow people to co-analyze these data sets together without technical barriers. They should be analyzing it according to the data use, but without technical barriers. So there's some design principles and considerations that have driven some of our architectural decisions that I wanted to highlight that were maybe things that people didn't know, because I know a lot of us do know many things already from working on the Anvil. We're not involved in billing right now. A user brings their own billing and we manage resources. So people can get institutional discounts. People can use different third-party providers. We'd like to stay out of this as much as possible, but if it hinders the user experience, then we may get involved in billing. And so we're figuring that out now. The scale is really critical for us. We have a lot of, right now, our usage in our platform is about 40% Broad researchers and 60% external, the last time I checked. We have a lot of users. We've got about 2,000 active unique users per month, 500 unique users per month running workflows and notebooks with a certain amount of overlap of people using both. On average, right now, they're running about 500,000 workflows per month. And the last time I checked, because right now this query is broken, it was more than 10 million CPU hours per month. And this was in May of 2019. So I don't know currently what the numbers are, but this is definitely actively growing. So scale is really critical, and we have to keep things up and running. Provenance is incredibly important to us. We want to be able to have reproducible data science. And in case people are not familiar with authorization domains, I'm not going to explain it too much. There's a diagram here in the slides, but basically we need a way to protect derived results because the original data has data use restrictions, as do derived results. And if you're bringing multiple data sets together, they've got more complicated data use restrictions. So this is a really critical thing in terms of how we think about analysis going forward. And with that, I'm going to pop off and hand over to Geraldine.
All right, thanks, Alex. Okay, so I'm going to pick it up here from the perspective of the end user. I had planned to do a live demo, but my home Wi-Fi is flaky, so it's going to be more screenshot based. Let me share my screen. And here we go. All right, do you see? Yep, okay, cool. Let's go presentation mode. All right, so this is just another version of what Alex showed you in terms of the idea that Terra is intended as the interface between data generators, tool and method developers, providing tools and data to ultimately the end users who are the life sciences and biomedical researchers. And right now I'm going to focus on two sets of functionality in Terra, in the Terra workbench, that has to do with executing workflows and doing interactive analysis, primarily with Jupyter notebooks right now. So there's a lot of other stuff that we could talk about. I'm going to focus on workflows and interactive analysis. Let's start with running workflows. What does it look like for the user? Now, first you have to remember or find out the workflow management system that is built into Terra is basically Cromwell. Cromwell is a workflow management system that we also develop that takes in WDL, WDL, workflows. So the workflow describes the load that the user wants to execute, provide inputs with JSON. Cromwell will then send that to the Pipelines API that is a managed service run by Google. And that'll orchestrate the execution of each task on its own worker virtual machine. So that's how Cromwell works when you're running your workflows on Google Cloud via the Pipelines API. You can run this outside of Terra completely independently on any platform. Within Terra, there is a Cromwell server that we manage so that the user doesn't have to do it. Okay, so you have your workspace. You'll have your workflow that you've imported within your workspace, either from the internal methods repository that we run, or from DocStore. And I believe the DocStore team will talk about that integration in their talk. So you bring in a workflow, you have basically a table of inputs that takes the place of your JSON of inputs, and you send that to the internal Cromwell server, and that Terra will take care of running things, sending the work to the Pipelines API for execution on Google. The data that you can compute on this way can either live in your workspace bucket. So each Terra workspace has a storage bucket that is dedicated to that workspace, but you can also compute on just data that sits elsewhere in GCS. So those are the main components that are involved in running workflows on Terra. In terms of what it looks like, you'll have a list of workflows that you've set up in the Workflows tab of your workspace. Here, this is my kind of favorite little toy workflow that just takes the GHK tool haplotype caller, which does variant calling. We parallelize that over genomic intervals. It creates a file called a GVCF. Then you have a bunch of GVCFs for different parts of your genome. Then you have a merge task, and you have the final file. So this is something we use a lot. It's a simple workflow that takes in a BAM file. The workflow itself is written in WDL, WDL. Technically, Cromwell can process CWL, but that is not supported in Terra at this time. So right now it's strictly WDL. So the user can see the script, cannot edit the script from within this interface, but they can edit within, if the workflow is in the Broad Methods repository, there's an editing function. Otherwise, you would do your normal development cycle, push to DocStore, and then pull the updated version into DocStore. Okay, so you've got your script. The inputs, there's two ways to provide inputs to your workflow in Terra. The first way is the simplest way, where you just, in your inputs form, you'll provide file paths to actually where the data file lives in Google Cloud. That's fine for demo and for getting started, but it's not scalable because you would have to do that manually for every single piece of data that you want to run on. And so the more sophisticated way is to actually use references to data tables. This is what we sometimes call data model, which trips a lot of people up, but ultimately we're just referencing entries in a data table. And let me show you what the data tables look like. You have the workspace data, which is a very simple table of key value pairs that allows you to basically provide a set of global variables for your workflows, where you can say, my GHK Docker is always this particular thing. These are the typical reference files that I use in all my analyses and so on. And then there's one or more tables of input data, and that's what we actually call the data model. And there you'll have your data entities, links to the files where they live in Google Cloud Storage, and so on. And just going back to the previous slide, you see here, for example, do you see my cursor, by the way? Yeah, cool. So you see the workspace.ghk docker. Well, that refers to this entry in the workspace data table. So if I do workspace.something here, the system will fill in the value once it launches. Same thing with this.input.bam. It's basically going to look up what data table am I running on, and look up what's in the input BAM column. And let's say I run on the father and the mother samples. For each workflow that is spawned by doing that, it'll fill in the appropriate file paths at runtime. And so this is a way, this is how we deal with the scaling to be able to run on any number of data entities, to be able to spawn a lot of workflows at the same time on just a big pile of data. That is the data model. Now, there's a similar functionality if you're using the references to data tables. You can also put in a reference for the output, so that, for example, my final output file will be associated with the data in the data table. So if I say this dot outputs GVCF, when the job completes and the file is created, it will be added in this table under the column with this name. And so this is a very convenient way to associate the outputs of a workflow with the data that it was run on. So that's the data input and output management basics for workflows in Terra. There's a job monitor that will allow you to look at the history of your jobs, the jobs that you've launched. You can drill down and see a lot of detail about individual jobs, steps, whether there were any errors and so on. Whoops. One of my favorite things is a timing diagram, which shows you for each task in your workflow how long it took. It'll also show you if your VMs were preempted, meaning where the jobs were interrupted and restarted and so on. This is very useful when developing workflows to kind of get a sense of what are the constraints, bottlenecks in your workflow and so on, which can be very helpful for optimizing both for cost and for time. Finally, a neat feature of the Cromwell engine is something called call caching. And call caching is the idea that if you've run the same combination before of the workflow code and the inputs, and it's the same files, the same parameters, it's the same container and the same version, if it's all the same thing, well, we don't want to run it again if we've already run it before. And so if you have that activated, every time you launch something, the system will check, have I run this combination of inputs before? It looks in the database. If yes, it'll skip the execution and just give you the output from the previous run. If it hasn't, then it'll actually run the task, register the results, and make the outputs available for future call caching. And that can be a huge time saver and money saver if you're developing workflows and you just want, you know, you're tweaking some task halfway down your workflow, and the early tasks, you don't want to have to run them again and again. So you just call cache and skip right through all that execution. Same thing kind of if you have a transient failure or something like that, you can just restart the workflow and it'll pick up where it failed. So this is very convenient. It's called call caching. And those are really the main points that you need to know to understand running workflows in Terra. Those are the main components. There's a lot of little additional options and so on, but I don't want to bore you with the details. But that's the meat of how it all works. Now, question, how do you actually get data to run on? There's a few different ways. First, you can just be in your workspace. You can upload, it'll be a TSV file, but basically you make a spreadsheet that lists your data entities, where the file lives, any metadata and so on. So that's fairly straightforward. You upload a TSV. If you're doing that, if it's your own data that you've put in the cloud, this is how you would load the information. The other way is through all these data repositories that we're hearing about. You can connect to those data repositories, grab the metadata to basically set up as data tables in your workspace. Now, how you do that exactly depends a lot on the repository. For example, here I'm showing the simple case, the 1,000 genomes high coverage that it's provided by as part of Anvil. It's simply a Terra workspace with data tables that list the metadata, the sample files, and so on. And so you can just go to that workspace, and then there's an option to export the data to the metadata for that data to another workspace, either an existing one or you can create a new workspace. So that's very straightforward and easy to work with. Another option is a lot of the other repositories have a dedicated explorer, data explorer. Here I'm showing the ENCODE one, which was one of the earliest ones, and allows you to look at various metadata and filter on that, filter down to the point where you have the data that you're interested in working on. At that point, you click the export button, and that allows you to again, grab the metadata, turn that into data tables that you then import into your Terra workspace. And so this is, you can create a new workspace, or again, put the metadata in an existing workspace, and it'll recreate the data tables. We're not copying any data around, we're just pointing and making references to the metadata that's in the repositories. Now, one complication here is, and I know some of you are working on this, is that if you have the metadata that is set up in different ways, meaning the column names are different, like you have samples instead of biosamples, or you have file ID versus identifier of file, or something like that. Depending on how things are called, you might actually have some harmonization to do before you can actually effectively bring in data from different repositories into a single workspace to do a joint analysis. So that's where one of the biggest obstacles to our end users lies, is the heterogeneity of how the various repositories are set up from that point of view. And that's going to be a community effort of developing the standards and developing layers as well that help the user do that harmonization, so that they don't have to go download huge spreadsheets and try to figure out how to do that themselves. That's kind of my soapbox. Okay, so that's workflows, basic data imports. The last thing I want to talk about is interactive analysis, doing interactive analysis in Jupyter notebooks. We have an RStudio integration that's in testing stage, I would say. It's available, but it's early days. So I'm going to focus on Jupyter notebooks. The idea here is that we make available to each user within a billing project, you have a notebook runtime environment, or more generally runtime environment. That is basically by default, it's a virtual machine that's provisioned with some default specs. And on that VM, we install a container that includes a Jupyter kernel. And so that allows us to run a Jupyter server that is dedicated for that user within that billing project. So if you have 3 billing projects, you have 3 separate runtime environments available to you, to be clear. And so you will share that runtime environment across your workspaces within your billing project. The notebook file itself, the notebook code is stored and saved automatically to your workspace. And when you open it, it gets copied to the runtime environment and opened up there. And at that point, it's very much like running a Jupyter notebook. As we saw earlier, you can do anything you would normally do in a Jupyter notebook within that environment. Now, I mentioned that there's a kind of a default configuration where it's one VM with reasonable resource allocations. It is possible to customize quite a lot. Now, first, from the point of view of the software, you can specify a custom container. If you want to do like a project-specific environment, you can specify your own container. And or these are compatible. You can also provide a startup script that is applied to the container when the runtime environment is being initialized. So if you want to have libraries and applications installed to the runtime, and you don't want to do it from within the Jupyter notebook, you can have that startup script be included when the environment is being initialized. And you can do both. You can provide a custom container and a startup script. Those are not incompatible. You can also customize the resource allocations. So in the runtime configuration menu, which you see on the left, You see that at the top, it's the configuration of the environment for the most part. So there's some predefined environments that you can switch between, or you can provide your own. There's a button somewhere to provide your own container. And then in the second part, in the second half, bottom half of the runtime configuration menu, you have the compute power. You can see that you can specify how much CPU, memory, disk size, and so on. And you can customize this. This is also where you would provide the startup script, which is an odd placement, but that's a soapbox for another time. Idea is that through this menu, you can customize pretty much everything about your runtime environment, including configure it as a Spark cluster if you need to do some very compute intensive work that can take advantage of Spark. And in terms of the end use, it's pretty straightforward. You'll have a notebooks tab in your workspace with a list of your whimsically named notebooks. You can share these. If you share a workspace with notebooks in it, what'll happen, because we don't want to have two people editing the same workspace at the same time, the same notebook at the same time, because there's an autosave that will gradually save the notebook back to your workspace as you work. So if you have your notebook open in editing mode and it's automatically getting saved regularly, if somebody else opens the notebook, the same notebook from the same workspace, it'll open in their own runtime, not in yours, but it will not autosave. There'll be a lock that prevents the autosaving. So they can open it either in preview mode, in playground mode, which allows them to work with it, but nothing gets saved back. Or they can make a copy, and if they want to edit at the same time, of course. Now, if you close your notebook, then the lock is lifted, and now they can start working on it if they want. And like I said, within the notebook, you can do pretty much anything that you would normally do. Here I'm showing one of the things that is probably a little less usual compared to, the assorted plotting and so on. You can do things like integrate visualization tools. The IGV genome browser, for example, there's a notebook library or plugin, I'm not sure what the right word is, that allows you to embed a viewer, and you can have several viewers embedded within a single notebook. And so you can interactively visualize various parts of your data. You can run commands. We also have an integration to have GATK running inside the notebook. So we can run GATK jobs and then visualize the results all within the notebook. And this is actually something we use heavily now in our GATK workshops. All our GATK workshops take advantage of that because it allows us to focus the teaching without having to worry about what's on their computer. So that's been a really helpful thing. So to sum up, your notebook lives in your workspace, gets copied over to the notebook runtime environment, where under the hood there's a container with a Jupyter notebook server. We are in the process of adding additional applications for interactive analysis. I mentioned RStudio, and the idea is to make it easy to have a variety of applications that can run in that runtime environment. Because although right now we're calling it the notebook runtime environment, there's nothing that's really specific. If you can bring your container with your application, you can use that compute. And that concludes what I wanted to show you of the functionality that's aimed at end users in Terra. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Geraldine. If I could grab the screen from you, I'll share mine.